correct. The Apple IIX had some of the fundamental ideas of the GS, which was to make a faster, larger memory, more graphics modes on the screen, to make the Apple II, the next stage, and to do some clever designs to basically use the same chips but get twice the performance, maybe. I mean, you have to start out with that kind of idea. And basically it was just saying, hey, the Apple II needs to be pushed one level higher. I think that would be, anyone would say, we agree this project should be a go and be given a lot of resources if they said the Apple II ought to go one level higher. And anyone who felt the Apple II shouldn't go a level higher would pretty much say, can't justify it in terms of payback. And I think, and it lost out.
And but eventually the GS made it. Was it, well, again, that may have been after you left, but was that another one of these stories if it was a product that was ready when the product was needed? Or?
Not really, no. The GS, there were a couple of good thinkers, a couple of smart engineers that had good ideas, that loved the ideas of a more powerful Apple II, that set out on their own to define how their ideas of how to improve it and make it a very regular structure, and basically came up with good ways of doing the graphics and the memory that integrated into the Apple II base that was there, the architectures, the software base, and yet give it a clean approach to higher graphics. And they came up with a clever sound method, hence GS. And that was, boy, it was real pleasing to me to see that they had really come up with, somebody had come up with a couple clever ideas in their head, and that sometimes makes a project go, when you come up with a clean way to do it.
One of the books, the historical books on the computer industry, talks about the WAS principle, by which they mean the design whereby you leave a computer open for third-party people to add to it, and you tell everybody how it works. And the book says, and I think it's right, that when IBM created the IBM PC, they copied a lot of the Apple II, and one of the things they copied was that in particular, the idea of leaving it open, which before the Apple II was something that was hardly ever done, and certainly in the computer industry as a whole, a big money-making one where we had IBM and the Seven Dwarfs.
Well, myths of our time can come about by accidental little articles that are catchy. And one of the myths of our time is that Bill Gates' meetings with Don Estridge and telling him to make the machine open so that third parties could have a big participation, and that was a big key to the IBM success. And it's so catchy that regardless of other factors that have made the IBM success happen, that might have made the IBM popular, regardless of those other factors, this is the one that gets major credit. It's very good sounding. It's part of the myth. The fact is, I am very much for open computers, for a lot of freedom for third parties to be able to come in and easily design clever products and add-ons. I'm always for that very, very much. It wasn't the case that I really thought out the Apple II that way and said it's got to be open. As a matter of fact, the myth regarding me being for openness and Steve Jobs being for closedness, we both are. I am for openness, he's for closedness in a lot of cases, but for different reasons than the way it sounds. But in the case of the Apple II, I had designed a very clever circuit. Before the Apple II, some little computers were coming out, and they each had to have some toggle switches on them to set their address. And that means they had to have chips to compare addresses, and it took a few chips back in those days to do it. And I don't like adding a lot of chips. Well, imagine a computer that has 8 slots. Every slot might have 5 chips plus 2 thumb wheel switches, simply to give them all addresses. I thought it out and said, let's take the address bits out of the microprocessor, decode them down a little bit, which you have to do anyway to address memory, and simply put in one little 8-way decoder and decode 8 lines, 1 to each slot. Now, each slot has a special set of addresses of its own, predefined, C100, C200, C300, and they don't need any toggle switches or chips. And so I did in one chip what would have taken 40 chips. I was clever. I'm clever whenever I think of a real clever way to save chips. So I wanted this. This design was beautiful. Steve Jobs came along and said, let's build it with 2 slots. Well, now, my reason for 8 slots wasn't to have the most slots. That wasn't my only reason. I really knew that you do need slots a lot because I worked at Hewlett-Packard. But my real reason was I had this clever circuit that I wanted to show off this way, and it just did 8 slots so beautifully. Like the chips, to sometimes should define the product. rather than marketing concept of people should define a product and then you put in the chips to do that. So that was really my reason for 8 slots, and when Steve said it's got to be 2, I said, well, get yourself another computer, and we went with 8.
Well, so this is incredible. So the whole open thing was because you could do it with no chips instead of 40 chips.
Well, that's a lot of where this rumor comes from. A lot of people then gave me credit for having wanted 8 slots so people could build boards, and Steve wanting 2.
Just to use fewer chips.
Yeah, it was because I had a clever circuit. That was the other half. It was half and half.
Well, from the perspective of 15 years or 30 years, if we go back even before the Apple I, what would you say was the best part of the Apple II experience for you personally?
The 2 to 3 years at the start of things was an experience, even before the company, if you add another year in there. Just the experiences I had in the club of designing computers, of starting to get some notoriety, of starting a company, of leaving Hewlett-Packard and forming a real big company, of having successes. But the first few years of the company Apple, nobody left. Everybody was excited, felt we were part of a revolution. It's a feeling like you almost can't go to a company now and have that feeling about. It's very rare, and Apple is not a normal expectation. Follow all the rules we did. You may not have the same story we had. We just had a lot of, young, unsuccessful people running around doing an extremely successful thing. And it was an amazing time. Nobody left the company. Nobody got fired. For that time, we were all good friends. It was very difficult to find again.
How about the worst part? Do you want to talk about what did you find the worst part of this whole deal?
Well, I don't know. Some of the worst parts I could talk about. Probably, I got, at a certain point in time, we all of a sudden had about 40 engineers, software and hardware, and I wasn't critical to the company like I had been. And I could just sit around and kind of do anything, but any job I took on, there was another engineer who could do that job well enough. So I wasn't really absolutely needed, and I wasn't going to be a manager and run the company because that wasn't me. And that started, but I had a plane crash, and that was sort of an out for me, in a sense.
Yeah, I remember that. You after the crash, you had some amnesia for a while?
Yeah, and then I went to finish my last year of college and get my college degree at Berkeley. And even while I was out, I was still very active in the computer world, going to a lot of computer clubs, talking, meeting people, seeing what was going on. And boy, I'd be in the outside world talking to people and seeing them do these incredible things with Apple IIs everywhere, and very rarely see an Apple III. And I'd come back to the company, and all you would see inside the company was Apple IIIs. All you'd hear people talking was Apple III language, and all you'd see them working on was some new Apple III project to make it start selling, to make it go further. And I got a very bad feeling. I just felt that something was horribly wrong and being missed when there was almost not a single Apple II project, maybe one or two projects allowed in the company at that time. And I thought there must be some big push from the top to prove that they were right about the Apple III all along, or something like that. And that was the hardest experience I ever had in Apple, was seeing how it was dealt with, because the flaws in the product, I saw a lot of different ones than most people see, but it just, I think the biggest flaw in the Apple III was it was a very closed machine. It had to be very difficult to build for slots and difficult to use slots. It was difficult to interface third-party software into. It was just difficult to take a lot of random directions. If you did exactly what Apple intended you to do, you were in great shape, but of course 1 year later that's always out of date. And here's an example of what happened in the Apple III during its design. We had to actually put extra chips into the Apple III to disable the 80 column mode when you went to the Apple II mode. When you flipped your switch to Apple II, you would have had 80 characters for free. An Apple II with 80 characters board plugged in, okay? And everybody was using that then. And we actually put in extra chips to turn that off, so that people wouldn't in their heads get psychologically confused between the Apple II being a home hobby machine and the Apple III being a business machine. There's something wrong. I don't know where that thinking comes from. It doesn't come from an engineer. It's some marketing thinking, that psychological thinking.